Mitsubishi. Do you think one story can combine ships, military jets, banking, Jackie Chan, racing, and 3 diamonds? Easily. Even though the list of words seems like gibberish and incoherent, the fact is all these words make up important parts of the origin and development history of a famous Japanese company, Mitsubishi Group. So, let's discuss it in detail. Almost everybody in the world knows or has at least heard about Mitsubishi, and the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, cars. And you're absolutely right. The company created a legendary Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution, a racing car that collected multiple awards in different races and became a legend. So now it's time to ask the question, what is the connection between Jackie Chan and Mitsubishi? Well, it's not a mistake, and don't worry, I'll explain it to you. Mitsubishi Motors had a long-standing advertising contract with action star Jackie Chan. So next time you drink a bottle of beer and watch an old Jackie Chan movie, pay attention to the cars on the screen. What you will see will remind you of our story. For example, the film Cannonball Racing 2 stars Mitsubishi in the leading role. Alright, well, let's go back to the history of the company. Ships, jets, and everything else has a connection and an explanation, believe me. Here we present an interesting and detailed story for you to learn the story of Japanese giant Mitsubishi Group, a consortium of independent Japanese companies in all kinds of industries, except for spaceflight. But wait, in 2020, Mitsubishi Electric decided to expand the space system business and built a new plant for satellites. Well done. Apparently Mitsubishi Group can do pretty much anything they want. Well, let's take a closer look at who Mitsubishi. Ernest Hemingway once said, "Every man was born for a single mission." Did you study literature at school? Ever read Hemingway? You know he was a talented writer, right? But if we're talking about Mitsubishi, his quote doesn't apply. The company slogan should be, "We'll try it and we'll do it." Now, perhaps he thought that Mitsubishi was into cars from the very beginning, but they weren't. They tried their hand in almost everything before they got around to making a car. Once upon a time, at the end of the 19th century, there was a brave and ambitious young man who lived in Japan. His name was Yataro Iwasaki. In fact, Yataro belonged to an ancient line of samurai. However, the family had so many debts that Yataro's grandfather had to sell his title. Imagine, you could sell a title back then. Well, the samurai family sold the title and started farming. When Yataro grew up, he wanted to study philosophy, but he had to quit and return home because his father had some problems with local authorities. Yataro tried to solve those problems, but ended up in prison himself. Imagine that. He was not in prison for long and was released. Things looked up for him. Instead of farming, he got a job at the shipping and trading company, and he worked very well. The company belonged to the famous, at that time, Japanese clan Tosa. They were very powerful and authoritative. Now let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, the story takes place at a time when Japan had just emerged from isolation and was making great strides in all directions. Japanese government supported industrialization and modernization. Not like before, the traditionalists would have hung you from a sakura tree for trying to introduce something foreign. No, just kidding. Japanese took on a different course. It was a good time to start a business. So in 1870, Yataro Iwasaki founded his first shipping company, Tsukumo Shokai. To do it, he leased 3 steamships from the Tosa clan. Later, he renamed his company from Tsukumo Shokai into Mitsukawa Shokai. Does that ring a bell? Mitsukawa? Does it remind you of anything in the present? Now, many Japanese historians oppose the claim that Yataro Iwasaki founded a company from scratch, and there's no need to shout this to the entire Pacific Ocean. It's much more correct to say that the Tosa clan founded Tsukumo Shokai. Yes, Yataro Iwasaki played a major role here. He was in charge, but not the owner. Anyway, let's continue. In 1873, Yataro Iwasaki bought the company Tsukumo Shokai from the Tosa clan. Now remember that at that time, its name was Mitsukawa Shokai. There is something familiar as later he renames it Mitsubishi Shokai. Finally, he becomes an owner and a president of the company. Actually, the company was renamed so many times, but we'll mention the most important names. In our story, we'll just call the company Mitsubishi and ignore the different prefixes for the sake of simplicity. Now probably, you're wondering what Mitsubishi means. Well, we'll tell you. Yataro Iwasaki was a serious man and an entrepreneur. He respected those who helped him and didn't forget the good. So when he thought about the logo for his company, he acknowledged the Tosa clan, who gave him his first job and helped him with his first steps in business. The Tosa clan had 3 oak leaves as its coat of arms, and the Iwasaki family coat of arms was 3 diamonds. Yataro decided to combine these 2 symbols, and he got the logo, which we can see today on Mitsubishi cars. Indeed, the word Mitsubishi is translated as 3 diamonds. Beautiful, isn't it? And note, he did not use his last name. Yataro wanted his logo to carry an idea that the company is honest, responsible, and open to partnerships, including international ones. Yataro created a brand, an excellent idea in a perfect form. So what's next? Yataro sees Japan's military expansion and decided to make friends and get support from the government. That's why, in a beautiful gesture, he supplied his ships for the transfer of Japanese soldiers to Taiwan in 1874. How patriotic. Yes, the Japanese government understood that they wanted to do business with Yataro Iwasaki and gave him ships and resources left over from the recently disbanded postal service. Yataro Iwasaki was happy to use it as a foundation for growth and power. Government connections began to pay off. Yataro had a friend in the Ministry of Defense who helped him with many issues. It's difficult to say to what extent the personal connections influenced business. However, the fact that Mitsubishi got more than 80% of Japan's shipping market by 1877 is undeniable. Back then, Mitsubishi could already be considered a major corporation. In Japan, the company are called zaibatsu, which means conglomerate or large association. By the 1880s, Mitsubishi owned shipyards and warehouses and ports. They even owned mines and insurance companies. And let me remind you that Japan is a lot of islands. Whatever is your business, you're bound to use the services of shipping companies. Yataro Iwasaki owned every eighth ship in Japan. Even unfriendly competitors had to use Mitsubishi's services, ships, warehouses, and insurance arrangements. Yataro Iwasaki had a fierce competitor, another zaibatsu called Mitsui. It was also supported by the government. Why did the companies use similar names, Mitsubishi and Mitsui? Perhaps just to confuse us, but it didn't work out for them. It is interesting to know that Mitsubishi's corporate rules at the time were samurai-like. Yataro strictly forbade using the services of competitors and communicating with their employees. He even implemented a rule that no relative of a Mitsubishi employee had the right to take a job with a competitor. Those who disobeyed had to pay a fine or get fired if they violated the rule. Tough rules, of course, but maybe it was worth it. Now, who are we talking about? Oh yeah, the main competitor. So, Mitsui couldn't do anything against Mitsubishi's strategy in the shipping industry, and as a result, the Kyoto Unyu shipping company, which was owned by Mitsui, was taken over by Mitsubishi in 1885. Eventually, Japan's largest shipping company, NYK Line, would grow out of the merger. One has to admit a competition with other zaibatsu put Mitsubishi in many difficult situations, but they always found a way out. In 1885, the same year, a very sad event happened. Yataro Iwasaki died of stomach cancer. The president died, but the business must go on and develop. The company was inherited by Yataro's younger brother, Yunosuke Iwasaki. And now it has to be said, Yunosuke managed the company very successfully. Yataro would be happy to see his business live on after his death. Mitsubishi, under the Iwasaki brothers' leadership, not only kept its position at sea, but also won over the land. They bought many copper and coal mines as well as large land plots. In short, the company expanded into all areas far and large. For crying out loud, he was a great success. Under Yunosuke Iwasaki, shipbuilding at Mitsubishi reached a new level. What did he do? Well, he just set up the production of big ships, steam-powered as it should be. Growing Japanese trading and military fleet improved the position of the company and the country. Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was growing steadily. So what does that mean? Does it mean that the Standard Oil company from our previous videos is an oil Zaibatsu? Not seen our video, you can watch that next. Those guys knew how to expand their influence in the market. Well, as you remember at the beginning of our big story, we talked about cars, but we haven't gotten into Mitsubishi's role in the car industry yet. We've listed ships, logos, mines, insurance companies, but be patient, we're getting there. As you understand, Mitsubishi was an influencing company in various industries in Japan. Well, we already know that, but there's one thing. All growth and power were built on the simple management principle, we manage as we can. European and American management systems, international experience, and practice were all ignored in Japan. Well, if you haven't had it, you need to get to it. Yataro Iwasaki had an older son. His name was Hisai Iwasaki. By wise decision of the father, Hisai was sent to study in the United States. Eventually, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied American know-how in management. When he returned home in 1893, he was appointed the president of Mitsubishi. In this position, he could apply his business knowledge gained in the U.S. Here we should mention that his uncle, Yunosuke Iwasaki, did not abandon all his business in Mitsubishi. He simply acted as an advisor to his nephew, the new president. In general, if you look at different histories of Japanese businesses, you can see that the Japanese like to do family business. And it's probably the right thing to do when money is not the only motivation. Hisai continued to develop and grow the company. He bought up factories and mines, increasing his independence from raw material partners. He bought gold and silver mines. Also, with his cousin, Hisai opened Japan's first glass factory. Again, family business, as we said. He opened new shipyards and modernized the existing ones. Now, Mitsubishi grew so strong and powerful that they were not afraid of any competition in the shipbuilding industry. Among other things, Hisai improved the management of the company. He adjusted various business processes and streamlined marketing, administration, and other managerial departments. It was very successful. Mitsubishi developed under Hisai's leadership until 1916. That year, he decided to retire and hand over all business and management to his cousin, Koyata Iwasaki. Koyata Iwasaki, by the way, was a Cambridge graduate, so he also knew what to do and where to go. On top of that, the guy had progressive views and was interested in promising industries. For example, he got interested in modern technology. To be more exact, he liked the production of cars. Alright, we finally got there. Now, the car industry was not a piece of cake as Koyata Iwasaki would have liked. Making cars is a complicated business. But no matter what, in 1917, the first Mitsubishi car, Model A, appeared in Japan. Now, the name does have something common with the names of Ford's cars, and if you look at the car, it becomes clear that it was, in fact, a knockoff, similar not only in the name. Well, Mitsubishi Model A resembled Henry Ford's legendary cars a lot. Look, isn't it Tin Lizzy? It was a copy of one of the Italian Fiat cars. I guess at that time, all cars were like each other. Really, if you look at a Mitsubishi Model A, it could be called the Lizzy pegboard. The body was made of wood. To be exact, it was made of an expensive cypress. Perhaps Japanese wanted to save money on metal or make their car more respectable. The car was marketed not for ordinary people, but for government officials and representatives of the ruling elite and businessmen. An average Japanese certainly could not afford to purchase it at that time. It was a sedan with rear-wheel drive, 4 doors, and a 35-horsepower 2.8-liter internal combustion engine. The interior was trimmed with imported materials, which only increased the cost. You could drive this automobile brainchild of the Japanese company at a speed over 50 miles per hour. Mitsubishi Model A was shown off at many Japanese exhibitions, hoping to make a name for itself. But to tell you a secret, the assembly of this car was so expensive. When you compare its price with import analogs, you would see that American and European models were much cheaper. It was the main reason why manufacture and demand for Mitsubishi Model A was very sluggish, to put it mildly. When later both Ford and GM production opened in Japan, Mitsubishi had no chance for success. In the end, the company abandoned the idea after 4 years. So here's a question. How many of these cars do you think they made? 22. Only 22 Mitsubishi Model A's. It means 5 cars per year. Not much of a rate, is it? Obviously, Mitsubishi failed to make cars at the beginning of the 20th century, but they didn't give up. They decided to innovate and invent. In fact, Mitsubishi was not discouraged and he was not going to give up car production. Knowing that the Japanese army needed trucks and that there were big government orders on the horizon, they decided, hey, let's make trucks for the army. So they did. The first experimental truck was made in 1918. It was the Model T1. At that time, the government organized the 620-mile truck race. The T1 took part and successfully passed the test, proving its reliability and practicality. And so the demand for trucks skyrocketed. The more, the better. Next thing you know, the company begins to produce buses beside trucks, and they were huge, gigantic buses. By the standard of that time, the buses were the biggest in the country. The first bus was called the B46, and it was in high demand. The buses were produced later under the Fuso brand. Now, you notice it looks like a school bus? By the way, all those cargo passenger vehicles came in handy while dealing with the earthquake consequences in 1923. In general, Mitsubishi ventured into the automobile industry again in 1920s, and in 1931, they made a breakthrough. The engineers of Mitsubishi created the first Japanese diesel engine for automobiles. It was 450 AD model with a capacity of 70 horsepower. Naturally, these engines were installed in trucks and buses right away, and they were sensational. In general, I have to say the 1930s was a good time for Mitsubishi. The country was rebuilding after the earthquake, the economy was recovering from crisis, it gave huge impetus for growth. The company at that time introduced and implemented new technologies in production in all industries, including the production of cars. For example, in 1934, Japanese engineers from Mitsubishi invented and produced a 4-wheel drive passenger car, PX33. They announced that they would develop the direction of SUVs. Why? Why not? It was a time when the great-great-grandfather of present Mitsubishi Pajero was born. In addition, the 1930s, the company developed several new diesel engines. The aspiration to innovate and to develop new technologies, combined with a desire to be better than their competitors, made Mitsubishi who they are, and to this day, the Mitsubishi Group live up to its motto. Well, you know a lot about the Mitsubishi automobile business in 1920, but let me tell you more interesting facts. Guess what? Mitsubishi ships sailed the seas, Mitsubishi cars drove on the roads. What's missing? Airplanes. It was planes that Toyota Iwasaki decided to make in addition to everything else. They decided to make military planes. Toyota seemed determined to supply the army with everything: ships, trucks, buses. Little did he know that first steps in aviation were very difficult. He had a lot to learn from experts in the industry. In 1918, Toyota sent Dr. Kumeso Ito to travel to Europe to gain experience. This doctor was a modest guy. We couldn't find his photo, and we only know his name. It's unclear why a doctor, but okay. To be accurate, we should mention that a few years earlier, Mitsubishi had already begun doing something for aviation. Toyota Iwasaki got wind of the Army's need for aircraft carriers and decided there was room for some serious action. He clearly dreamed of having his company's planes take off from his company's aircraft carrier. So, Kumezo Ito went to France to learn the art and specifics of aircraft construction. Together with sightseeing Paris and Eiffel Tower for a couple of years, he gained experience and knowledge in aircraft production and returned to his homeland in 1920. As soon as he returned, the company set up a separate aviation department, and so it went. The interesting fact is that Mitsubishi tried to hide that they were interested in the aviation industry. Apparently, the samurai knew something. It is either Dr. Kumezo Ito got distracted by women or had other avenues for his talents, but in 1921, Mitsubishi invited the English design engineer Herbert Smith to its aircraft production. That guy had a lot of practical experience, and the most important, he understood peculiarities of deck aviation. You remember the aircraft carriers, right? Toyota Iwasaki was very right to bring foreigners into the company. Why cram, bump, experiment, and waste time on mistakes if you can bring in an expert who already gets it? Later, Mitsubishi did very well in aviation. Herbert Smith worked for Toyota for 3 years, and during those 3 years, 3 planes were built, one of which is noteworthy, the Mitsubishi 1MF. Why do we single it out? Because it was the first Japanese aircraft that was able to take off and land on the deck of an aircraft carrier. It was adopted by the Japanese Army as early as 1923. More than 120 of these jets were made in 5 years. In short, the Army's confidence in Mitsubishi was growing. It worked out great for both parties. One got money, the other got aircrafts. After all, the 1940s were approaching, and World War II was on the horizon. Despite efforts to hide the production from mass media, now it was known that by 1940, Mitsubishi built 6 aircraft factories and 11 aircraft engine plants. Some of the factories were located in Hiroshima City, much to the misfortune of its inhabitants. Do you understand, friends, how important Mitsubishi was to the Japanese Army? In 1937, the Japanese invaded China and the Japan-China War began. If you've been paying attention, you'll remember that we talked about militarization earlier that preceded this whole bloody mess of World War II. So now the story gets to the point where the whole world was on the verge of the abyss. It's a good time to take a closer look at Mitsubishi's role in the military. Although we've talked about it a little bit, let's add some specifics, numbers and names. Believe me, you'll be surprised at how influential it is. Alright, let's go. We'll start again at the sea. Mitsubishi's been building ships for the Japanese Navy since World War I. Thanks to Mitsubishi and other shipbuilding company Kawasaki, Japan did not depend on imported warships. All important Army and commercial projects were built at the shipyard in Nagasaki City. Pay attention to the names of the 2 cities in our story, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, plants and factories of Japanese military industry were located there. In 1912, Nagasaki plants began building the cruiser Kirishima. The ship was finished in a year, and in 1913 it sailed the ocean under the flag of the Japanese Navy. In 1915, they began building the battleship Hyuga, which was even larger than the previous one. Later, the company built a great number of cruisers, destroyers, super battleships, and even L-1 type submarines. It means that Mitsubishi supplied the Army not several ships, but most of the ships in the fleet. The first ships were already equipped with steam turbine engines. Advanced technology was used for the vehicles for the Army. Now let me explain that the words cruisers and destroyers mean the type of large warships stuffed with artillery and equipped with heavy armor. The first aircraft carrier was built at the shipyard in Yokohama and built by the company Mitsubishi in 1933. That was the cherry on the cake. We do not have too much time to dwell on all the details of Mitsubishi's participation in the military shipbuilding, so let's summarize that by the beginning of World War II, the Japanese Navy was a great power due to direct contribution of Mitsubishi. In military aviation, after the creation of Mitsubishi 1MF, about which we mentioned earlier, the pace and improvement also increased. In 1936, the old 1MF was replaced by the more perfect A5M deck fighter, and after a while, in 1939, the legendary A6M-0 appeared. That was the one that attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, when the Japanese made a horrible meat grinder on the island. Indeed, this plane was a scary predator in the sky. They say that one of the original planes was filmed during the making of the movie about Pearl Harbor. During World War II, even the American pilots admired the plane. It was maneuverable and fast, a real masterpiece. How can we prove to you that the plane was popular? The best proof is that from 1940 to 1945, Mitsubishi built over 3,800 Zeros, and another 6,500 were built under license by other Japanese companies. The A6M-0 also carried the infamous suicide bombers. Now, these aren't made-up legends. The Japanese Army had kamikaze pilots. In addition to aircraft carriers, Mitsubishi also produced bombers, torpedo carriers, and spy jets in huge quantities. Almost all Japanese aviation during World War II was built by the Three Diamonds. And now we are going to hit a nail. Mitsubishi also made tanks in series production. They also sold their licenses to other companies. They had been assembling tanks since 1936, so by the beginning of World War II, many Japanese tanks, both light and heavy, were Mitsubishi tanks. Compared to airplanes and ships, they didn't make such a big splash in tank building. Now, here's an interesting thought. What are Japanese cars famous for? Reliability. And where does that come from? Have you ever thought that it is because once, before the Second World War, all Japanese production was for the army? During the war, machinery must work without fail. Maybe that's where Japanese reliability comes from, combined with the samurai attitude, of course. Well, whatever the case, we know the outcome of World War II for Japan. Japan surrendered in 1945, the economy was destroyed. After the victory, Allies decided to disband all major industrial zaibatsu. Why? Because they supplied and supported Japan's military power. And it wasn't just Mitsubishi. All big businesses were split up. Fortunately, they weren't destroyed. Humanity was not interested in Mitsubishi's achievements because most of them were used in a bloody war. Koyata Iwasaki tried to find a way out. He addressed his partners. "We've always been good partners. Why are you doing this to us?" You have to admit that as a business partner, Koyata really had always been very reliable. Nevertheless, Mitsubishi Zaibatsu was dissolved in 1946. The company was divided into dozens of small subsidiaries. It is a similar story of Standard Oil. Divide big if it's too influential. So Zaibatsu were split up, and the trade name Mitsubishi was forbidden to use at all, until 1952. Then, the ban lifted, and all subsidiaries returned the name Mitsubishi. After several mergers in 1954, there appeared again the Mitsubishi Corporation. And they went back to their glory days. To be more exact, they started to grow and expand their business, on water, in the air, and then in many other places. And of course, in the automobile industry. In 1970, a division of Mitsubishi Motors emerged. At first, they made scooters, trucks, pickups, and then started to make cars, despite the fact that they did not do well in the beginning of the 20th century. This time, though, they succeeded and it worked. Everybody in the world knows the Mitsubishi model families as Lancer, Galant, Colt, Pajero. At the end of the 20th century, Mitsubishi Motors invented the GDI system of direct fuel injection for gasoline engines. It gets the fuel injected directly into the cylinder under pressure through nozzles. In old gasoline-powered engines, the fuel mixture injects into a manifold, a reservoir, and is sucked out by a vacuum into the cylinders. Mitsubishi engineers came up with a great idea for fuel economy. Eventually, having recovered from the post-war shock, Mitsubishi became a huge company again, proving that it was impossible to be useful in peacetime and forget about past sins. In the automobile industry, they achieved excellent results. In fact, at the end of the 20th century, Mitsubishi cars were the third most popular in Japan. Third place? And who do you suppose took first and second place? Well, that we'll tell you all about in our next videos.